Welcome, everyone, to this very special After Dark Online. I want to welcome everybody from Facebook and YouTube. We have folks standing by to answer questions and get questions to me, so please feel free to interact with us tonight. I am thrilled to introduce our guest tonight. Nathaniel Rich is a novelist and journalist and the author of Losing Earth, A Recent History, which received awards from the Society of Environmental Journalists and the American Institute of Physicists, and was a finalist for the Penn E. O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. The book expands on his article for the New York Times, which explored a brief period in the 1980s when scientists almost convinced the Bush administration to enter into an international agreement to curb climate change. Nathaniel is also author of the novels King Zeno, Odds Against Tomorrow, and The Mayor's Tongue. He is a writer at large for the New York Times and a regular contributor to The Atlantic, Harper's, and the New York Review of Books. His new book, Second Nature, Scenes from a World Remade, will be published this month, and we're thrilled that we're the first interview he's doing about second nature. Welcome, Nathaniel.
Thanks for having me. It's great to talk to you, Mary.
Nathaniel, let's get into the title of the book, Second Nature, Scenes from a World Remade. It has this very interesting glowing bunny on the cover. I imagine there's a story there, both about the title and the striking image. What did you want to convey with this?
Yeah, well, Second Nature is really about the eeriness of living at this time when there's no longer anything natural about the natural world. And it's about people who, it's stories, nonfiction stories, reported stories, told in the third person. And I wrote about people who are coming to this realization, often in very, violent even, or, shocking ways, and about people who are trying to figure out the way forward. And towards the end of the book, there are stories about people who are trying to use some of the technologies that have brought us to this place, and have caused so much devastation to our natural world, using the same technologies to repair some of the damage we've done, and all of the hubris and unintended consequences that carries with it. And so the stories move chronologically from stories about people who are coming to terms with this problem to people who are looking forward to the future. But they all have in common a sense of the uncanny, really, about living in this transitional moment where we've come to terms with what we've done to the planet, but we're still trying to determine what kind of responsibility we want to have for where we're going.
So, I mean, that's a really interesting point that you make, that there's really no such thing as the natural world. Everything has been impacted by humans. That's very philosophical. And, you tell these stories through the eyes of through the experiences of humans. What do you want people to do with that information? It's sort of like, I think it's kind of out there for people to take in and do something. What do you hope people will think about or do based on some of these stories?
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like there is a tradition of literature, of activist literature that's written exactly for that purpose, to motivate people to act and to take certain, to vote in a certain way and to take certain, positions. And I think that literature is really important. But what I felt was missing from the conversation over, not just climate change, but really this massive global environmental transformation that we're in the middle of, was an understanding or an exploration of how these massive crises and the scariness of this time touch our own inner lives, our own personal lives. How does it shape our culture? How is it shaping the way that we see ourselves, the way we see the future, the way we think about, having children and other, personal questions. And so it's the intersection between these great public crises and our own private crises that I feel like storytelling has a power, a unique power to explore. And so I'm certainly not giving people answers, but I hope that I'm asking some questions that haven't been asked before.
Yeah, that I think that's just so important, that people are not, told what to do, but through these stories, they're maybe choosing some paths.
I mean, I also think it's important, when I try not to write about, I'm not really interested in writing about stories where I feel like there are clear answers, where they lead to some kind of prescription. I'm more interested in stories that I find, at least in my first encounter with them, to be unsettling in some way, that sparks some kind of moral tension. And I think that's where the best stories are, and that's where I feel like there's an opportunity to go a little deeper into some of these matters.
Mm-hmm. So one of the first books that you wrote, you lived in San Francisco for a while. Just put that out there, San Francisco. You wrote a book about San Francisco noir. So I'm imagining that you are a fan of film. So I'm just going to do a little something. You can tell me if this is really off base, but you have 3 sections to Second Nature. And I thought maybe we could sort of talk about the 3 sections as film genres. So the first section, go with me.
I like it. That's good.
I'll drop this, but it just occurred to me when I was reading the first section about crime scene, it sort of definitely seemed like a horror movie to me. Some of the scenarios that you're kind of writing about sort of seem like unsuspecting people threatened by an invisible enemy until an intrepid hero or a bunch of teenagers figure out what's going on. I don't know. Maybe
I like it. I buy it. I think, the early stories, which are stories of people who are having some kind of experience that shocks them. So there's a story of a corporate lawyer who discovers this decades-long conspiracy by DuPont to essentially to poison every one of us. There's a story about this sea star wasting epidemic where all these sea stars along the Pacific coast suddenly started essentially committing suicide. These are stories about, and a story about a mysterious gas leak that people attribute every kind of horrible thing in their life to, whether justified or not. So yes, there absolutely is a horror element that I felt both reporting these pieces and reading and writing them.
So let's get a little deeper into that. I think that the first chapter for me just kind of hit me hard, and it's the story about a West Virginia farmer, Wilbur Tennant, and his lawyer. And his cattle started getting sick, and he was trying to figure out what's going on. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about the farmer and the lawyer?
Yeah, it's one of the most incredible stories I've encountered in my career, and it's now a major motion picture called Dark Waters, and it's the story of this corporate lawyer, Robert Ballard, who's a real straight up conservative guy. There he is. He lives in Cincinnati, and he works as a defense lawyer for chemical companies like DuPont. His firm's always trying to get contracts with DuPont, in fact. And he gets a call from this farmer, Appalachian farmer in West Virginia, who says that DuPont has been killing his cows. And Ballard, doesn't really believe it and is about to hang up on him when the farmer says the name of Ballard's grandmother. And it turns out that this farmer got Ballard's phone number from a neighbor. It was a family who was Ballard's grandmother's friend, basically, and Ballard himself had been out to this farmland as a child. And rode cows there, rode horses there, and so on. And so Balad, out of this kind of nostalgic, personal connection, emotional connection, really, to this place and to these people, decides to look into it, not expecting to find anything. And soon this farmer comes to his office in Cincinnati, carrying these huge boxes of documents and home videos that he's made. And Balad sees that over the years, Wilbur Tennant has been documenting all of these horrific things that he's encountered on his cattle farm, which is fed by a creek that comes from a landfill that's owned by DuPont, which has this massive chemical factory in town that makes Teflon, among other things. And so I think we have a clip of some of this footage that Tennant brings into this high-rise, corporate office in Cincinnati. He puts a VHS into the player, and he shows them this. And I think we have it, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, here we go.
1997. And what I'm about to show you here in a little bit is part of this landfill.
So this is his land, and this is the creek that runs through it.
I'll show you back in here in a little bit what I'm talking about. This is the upper end of this riffle. And right there's the mouth of Dry Run. This is what I'm talking about. We haven't had any rain now for several days, and the temperature's up in the 60s today. This suds has been here for a while. That's one bunch of them. State of West Virginia issued E.I. DuPont Company a permit for them to run their contaminated wastewater down through two farms here, private property or whatever they want to call it, out into this stream of water here. Now on this riffle right here, I've taken 2 dead deer and 2 dead cattle off of this riffle right here. And they tell me the deer died with hemorrhaging disease. Well, it was hemorrhaging disease, all right. The blood run out of their nose and out of their mouth. But they've never, DNR has never checked into it.
So we could probably...
The EPA of the state of West Virginia, it's trying to cover this stuff up. But it's not going to be covered up because I'm going to bring it out in the open for people to see.
So we could probably end it there before we get the actual images of the dying cattle.
Won't tell you what the anti-substance fluid consists of.
It's like a horror film. It comes back. And he did dissections of the cattle and so on. And so what he's talking about, if you could make it out the accent, is he had gone around the town of Parkersburg, West Virginia, trying to get people to pay attention to him. And he went to veterinarians and doctors and politicians and journalists and lawyers, and nobody would take his case. No one would listen to him because they were essentially all owned in some way or fashion by DuPont. The whole community essentially felt like it owed its existence and its economic stability to this factory. And so he had to go outside of the community, and he found Balad, and he hit the jackpot because Balad, at that point, began to he realized that something was terribly wrong, and he began this process that's ongoing to this day, more than 20 years later, of combing through millions of pages of documents and using all of the strategies at his disposal, and most importantly, using his inside information of the way these chemical companies work in order to get to the bottom of this. And what he discovers, of course, is that a man-made chemical called PFOA, it has several other terms and there's some related chemicals, but that this chemical that was being manufactured and used in Teflon and many other products and applications by DuPont does not biodegrade and is a toxin and has been poisoning, not only poisoning the cows, not only poisoning the people in this community through the water and through the air, But because of the ubiquity of these chemicals, so-called forever chemicals, it's poisoned all of us. We all have PFOA now in our bloodstream. And so he has, through this time, been fighting this battle and has had some major victories in holding DuPont finally responsible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's great that he won that judgment, but you point out that $16.5 million judgment, which seems like significant amount, was fraction of their, of their income or their profit for 1 year.
Yeah, he won the largest judgment in the history of the EPA at the time, but this is a company that was making more than $1 billion of profit every year off of PFOA, and they started using this stuff in the 1950s. And what's worse, of course, is they knew in the 1950s and in increasing with increasing certainty and detail as the decades passed that this stuff was killing people, was causing all kinds of horrible health conditions, birth defects, but they stayed with it and they covered it up because they were making so much money. It's the oldest story in American capitalism.
Yeah, you point out in the book that the chemical industry essentially regulates itself. Can you explain what you mean by that? I think people mostly assume that's the job of the EPA.
Yeah, it's pretty shocking. One of the most shocking things about doing this research was learning that it's not only that is this PFOA is in my blood, but also that the chemical industry is essentially unregulated, or it regulates itself. The major bill, chemical regulation bill TSCA, was passed in the 1970s, but it really only pertains to about half dozen chemicals, and the rest have either been grandfathered in, or the companies themselves that are constantly inventing new chemicals for all kinds of industrial, commercial uses. The burden is on them to tell the government if any of these new chemicals are dangerous. And so, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that, companies are pretty good at not telling on themselves. And this is the most egregious example that we know about. But of course, as you said, there's something like 85,000 man-made chemicals in the market. We're exposed to, dozens, if not hundreds, every day in our daily lives. And we really don't know what's out there, and we don't know what we're ingesting. And for Balazs, this whole discovery, this disillusionment, really changes his whole life. It takes over his life. It destroys parts of his life. It isolates him in his community. And in some ways, I feel that Balazs is a kind of avatar for all of us when we have this moment. I think which so many of us do, where we come to realize that some of the assumptions that we held about how the world operates, about nature, about our health, are completely overturned by experiences that we have, and it forces us to really reckon with what we've done, how we've gotten to this point, and what kind of responsibility we have as we move forward.
Yeah, I know that as you said, they're called forever chemicals, or they've been called that for a reason. And we're actually going to have a program about that after dark on April 29th with the San Francisco Department of Environment, because they're finding that these chemicals actually impact people's susceptibility to COVID, heat stroke. So it's climate change, and these chemicals are kind of colliding with each other to the detriment of people's health. So
yeah, and I should say, Rob. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, please.
That Rob is now, after suing on behalf of Wilbur Tennant and then these communities in West Virginia, he's now suing on behalf of every American citizen to hold DuPont responsible for all of this.
Mm-hmm. So let's move on to the second section of your book. It's called Season of Disbelief. And we're going to do the sort of storytelling motive. To me, this sort of seems like classic Joseph Campbell hero's journey. I don't know. Maybe I'm stretching that.
Interesting. Yeah, I see. Yeah, I mean, these are stories about people who are coming to terms with the eeriness of where we're at right now. I could see that. I could see that. I also could see a kind of like a 70s sci-fi vibe of,
Don't take away my 70s sci-fi. I'm
oh
thinking
no,
that
we're saving that for the end, maybe.
I
Yeah,
think I'm
no.
saving it for the end. But anyway, so you write, there's kind of many different, human stories in there, sort of grappling with, as you said, this world that we've created, but also kind of trying to deal with it. And so I think I'd love you to tell us about the journey of, the son of a grocer and butcher who goes through molecular gastronomy chef and then to a high-tech company in San Francisco. Can you tell
Yeah,
us about his journey?
yeah, it's a journey in two generations from meat packing, sort of heart of central Illinois, to downtown San Francisco, and Henry Park is the father. It's a father and son story, and Henry the father grows up in this small town where, when he wanted chicken from the store, he would go to the grocery store and they would slaughter a chicken that they had living, and they had chickens running around in the basement, and a butcher would go downstairs, slaughter the chicken, and bring it up for the customer. And Henry goes into cutting meat, as he puts it. He doesn't call himself a butcher, although that's what I would call him. It's sort of too grandiose a term for him. And he raises a family and he's the town butcher. He's sort of the center of the town community. People trust him. He's the person they turn to on special occasions to make holidays just right. And he hopes to pass on his business to his son, Nate. But Nate has other ideas, and he casts out. He sort of wanders around a bit before becoming a chef at Moto, the restaurant in Chicago that revolutionized this idea of molecular gastronomy, using high-tech approaches, scientific approaches to food, and doing things where they sort of mix up the form and the flavor, so that you have dishes like one of their most famous dishes is a dish that looks like a burning Cuban cigar in an ashtray, but is actually a Cuban sandwich. And they had a little bit of a celebrity for a period in the culinary world, and restaurants like that cropped up in San Francisco and elsewhere. But soon those chefs started to get hired by the Silicon Valley startups who were interested in creating meat in a lab, cultured meat, where they would the big idea is to mass produce meat without killing any animals. So it's not like the Impossible Burger, where it's a non-meat product made to look or taste like meat, but it's actual meat but cultured in a lab. And so this story is about this relationship between this father and son. The father is a butcher, and the son is, some kind of futuristic version of a butcher who's doing experiments all day in a laboratory in Soma in San Francisco to create the perfect chicken nugget.
And tell us, why was he so obsessed with lab meat as opposed to chicken meat? It seems like there was another reason why he went that way.
Well, it's like so many of these new innovations that we're faced with now, where one's first response to it is sort of to be, I'll speak for myself, is just to be a little creeped out or disgusted. The idea that you would have a chicken breast manufactured in a lab, that could ever be desirable, just seems bizarre. But then, when you start to think about it and understand, well, there's nothing natural, first of all, about the agricultural industry, the mass farming industry in this country, the level of animal cruelty, and cruelty also, of course, to people who work in these meat cutting plants. Not to mention the enormous climate impacts of this kind of farming. It's one of the leading drivers of greenhouse gas emissions in this country. And then you also have to even go back and say, well, there's nothing really natural about the domestic chicken either. This is a food that we've essentially created from a bird that was once known as a jungle fowl that lived in jungles and looked very different, that we've bred into its current form. And so once you sort of think all about that and all the suffering and death that's caused by this industry, the idea of meat that doesn't cause any of these things, it doesn't have any of these ramifications, is a lot more appealing. And the idea is that, some portion of the global meat-eating market will always be resistant to vegetarianism, to not eating meat at all. So why don't we make a meat product for them that can at least solve some of these major global problems? And so then it starts to make a little more sense, but there is this sort of uneasy tension, I think, between the sort of intellectual explanation for it, which is an ethical argument. Fundamentally, there's an ethical case to be made there, and then the sort of the kind of queasiness one feels at the idea of it that is still is hard to strip out entirely.
Yeah. So
we have a clip. Actually, there's a clip of that. A promotional clip from the chicken company. Yeah, here we go. So this is their chicken nuggets and some dudes at a barbecue or at back door.
Looks yummy.
So that's Ian. And there's Ian. So they're eating that bird. They're eating cells taken from that bird, cultured into a lab. And Ian's fine with it. So.
That is hilarious.
And I should say that they've just a couple months ago, Singapore has become the first country in the world to authorize the sale of this kind of meat. So if you go to Singapore today, there's a restaurant there that is selling Ian nuggets. Yeah.
He's famous. So as I mentioned at the top, you're a novelist and you use narrative in your nonfiction writing, especially the way you flesh out your characters and tell big environmental stories through a human lens. Can you talk a little bit about how and why you cross over into journalism to write about climate change and environmental degradation? Why not just stay with the novel?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it came out of a frustration originally that I wasn't reading the kind of work that about these issues that I felt it demanded. That there's so much great reporting about climate change. There's great reporting about the politics, about the role of the oil and gas industry in thwarting any kind of progress. And there's increasingly, better reporting about, the plight of people who are suffering right now from climate change. But I did feel that there is still something missing from that whole conversation, which is sort of where we started the conversation about, how do these issues touch all of us, even when we're not in the middle of a hurricane? How does it shape our reality? I feel that we've entered a very different moment now, and it's this, especially for younger people on this planet, one's most sort of fundamental ideas about one's own future, and the kind of work we do, the kind of aspirations we might have, are increasingly influenced by this knowledge of this impending or ongoing slow motion tragedy. And I felt that it really took narrative storytelling to get to that. So I've written about these themes in fiction. I mean, Odds Against Tomorrow takes up these themes, but I also felt that there were stories and there were kinds of stories to be told in nonfiction that hadn't been told, and that's so I saw that there was a place for a contribution there, and that's where I've focused my energies. But I think these themes are with us. This is the fabric of our reality now. We're living in this age where every year is warmer than the last. Every year it brings more disaster, more massive transformations, and more sort of wilder efforts to try to solve some of these problems. And so I feel like one can't really write honestly about this moment in time whether in nonfiction or in a novel, without absorbing some of that. It's, in the same way that I think a novel written in the middle of World War II couldn't help but be haunted by the specter of the war. I feel that that's true for our time as well. And so, and at the end of the day, I don't really distinguish too greatly between nonfiction and fiction. There are some stories that I think are better suited to nonfiction and some that are better suited to a novel.
Mm. So you mentioned Odds Against Tomorrow, your novel, which is about New York City flooding under a combination of sea level rise and storm surge years before Hurricane Sandy did its damage. Where did you get the idea to flood Manhattan, and did it feel awful or satisfying that you essentially predicted the future?
That felt awful when Hurricane Sandy happened, and it wasn't that long after the book. Actually, it was right before the book was published, but after it was completed. And but I wasn't drawing from. It wasn't this wild fantasy. I mean, I was just reading, really reading government reports about possible, things that could happen to New York or things that were expected to happen. The sort of risk analysts of city agencies, and this idea of a hurricane hitting the city causing massive flooding kept recurring. And so I actually set out to create a very realistic novel about the next time that a hurricane hit New York, which was inevitable, of course, as it's inevitable that another one will come. And yet the fact that Sandy then came, I think had it not been for Sandy and I had published that book, it would have been received as a kind of fantasy science fiction novel, and instead it was received as a kind of documentary depiction of Sandy. And so, but I think that sort of speaks to the time that we're in. What once seemed dystopian and fantastic is now our everyday, and I think we're adjusting to that still, culturally, psychologically, to this just constantly unfolding cataclysms.
Mm. So you talked about writing your nonfiction not in the first person. A lot of people do put themselves in the story, but you mostly avoid being the character in your book. But you live in New Orleans with your family. And to me, it's obvious that you are deeply familiar with Louisiana's history and its landscapes and the characters that you describe, the chapters that you describe about the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in the Ninth Ward, the degradation of the Plaquemines parish, which you write extensively about in the book. And Louisiana was also the subject of your novel King Zeno, set in New Orleans in 1918, that dealt with so many topics that are relevant today, the deadly flu epidemic, and the construction of the industrial canal, which was basically trying to control the Mississippi River. Is that just the cause of so much of what Louisiana and New Orleans is suffering now, that first construction?
Well, the penning of the Mississippi River, capturing it between levees is a big part of it, and that's led to the destruction, is a major factor in the destruction of the coastal marsh under New Orleans, which is the buffer that we have against hurricanes. But the industrial canal is what flooded famously in Katrina, destroying the lower Ninth Ward, and is a kind of perfect example of a hugely hubristic, ambitious infrastructure, control of nature plan by humanity to try to tame a natural environment that backfired catastrophically, not just in Katrina, but also before that in Hurricane Betsy. And so, yeah, and what's fascinating now about Louisiana, and I think a lot of people don't know this outside of Louisiana, is that, as backward looking as the state can be at times, and as sort of haunted by its past as it is, it's actually on the vanguard of of climate policy. The world's, I think it's safe to say, the world's largest climate change mitigation plan right now is the Louisiana's Coastal Master Plan, which is the effort by the state with the Army Corps of Engineers to rebuild the coast that's been depleted over the last 100 years. It's lost about the acreage of Delaware, and it's constantly, the marsh is constantly melting into the Gulf of Mexico, and so there's this plan to harness the power of the Mississippi River and to create essentially new distributaries off of the river to reseed the marsh with sediment from the river, and grow land, to actually grow thousands and thousands of acres of land to give us a buffer back against sea level rise and hurricanes. Mm-hmm. And so it's a fascinating story, and it also puts Louisiana at the vanguard of a lot of these questions that I think climate policy people have only started to pose, or at least that the public has only begun to debate about unintended consequences and sort of moral questions about, how do you do these massive transformations of a landscape in an ethical way that doesn't harm too many people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you write about this very expensive, comprehensive master plan that for Louisiana that has benefits for a lot of people, but hurts a few people. So as you were kind of researching this and talking to people, what advice do you have about how to make change right for those who suffer? Like, we know that those are most especially impacting poor and minority communities that lack power and always get the short end of the stick. Though are they still suffering under this master plan? And what do we do to kind of try to make things right for them?
Yeah, it's quite striking. I mean, we're talking about this area south of New Orleans, Plaquemines Parish, the bottom part of the Mississippi River. And I think we have some photographs of a house, the way the houses look there, which is that over the years they've been, and this is a fascinating picture actually, because you can see in the very back a house in the it looks like it's in a forest, but it's actually been overtaken by weeds and some trees. And there's even a third house on this property. I think it's behind that one, or maybe off to the side. And you can see the history of Plaquemines Parish when I went down there to interview people who live there in these three houses. And you see that each house gets higher and higher off the ground as the waters, rise, as the Gulf encroaches through the marsh, and as there's less protection against floods and hurricanes. So now everyone has to be at least something like 17 feet off the ground to even qualify for insurance. And so it's so the master plan is really designed to, among many of its objectives, is also to save these people. The land that the folks live on down there, they have the river in their front yard essentially with a levee, separated by a levee, and in their backyard they have the marsh. There's only about the width of one property between them, and if nothing is done, this land will vanish in the next, some number of years, whether it's 10 or 30, we can't be sure, but it'll happen pretty soon. And yet the people who are most against the master plan, who are the most vocal opposition to the master plan, are these same people in this community. And the reason is that predominantly they're fishermen, and they make a living from fishing in the swamps down there. And the master plan, by diverting the Mississippi River and sending just like enormous amounts of fresh water into the marsh, will destroy fishing conditions in a lot of these communities. And so their argument is essentially, I don't care about 10 years from now. I care about making a living this year. And these people already have been hard times. And so it creates a really difficult moral problem. It's easy for me in New Orleans, protected by massive new levee, to say, okay, okay, sorry, fishermen, but we need to save, 1.5 million people here, not to mention all of the other, the port, the viability of the Mississippi River, and, it's a third of American, agricultural import exports and so on. But try going to Plaquemines and telling that to an oysterman who's just having their livelihood and their culture destroyed. And so it's the kind of difficult, these plans have almost unanimous support in Louisiana, in a red state. It's really striking since they're really climate adaptation plans. Of course, the state never uses the term climate change when talking about it, but that's what they are. And but what do you do about these people? And it's a similar question to, I think what's happened. You see it in places like West Virginia, where coal miners are losing their jobs, and more will lose their jobs until the industry is dead. And so, what do you do about them? And of course, there are a lot of other people who are far more harmed, by all of us are greatly harmed by this industry. So it's a small subset of the population, and yet they do have a moral claim that they shouldn't be just completely abandoned. So you see, I think there are solutions that come around. I mean, the Green New Deal is very vocal on this point, but it's difficult, and a lot of these people don't just want to check. They don't just want to be paid off. They don't want to lose their home, their culture, their community. And so it's the kind of question that I think we're going to see increasingly in the years ahead. And it's become a fascinating laboratory, not only sort of ecologically and in terms of the engineering of the whole thing, but also morally, ethically. How do we do this the right way?
Yeah, and as you said, the coast of Louisiana is kind of fighting this battle against sea level rise and depletion, and it you've got a master plan, but it's looking kind of hopeless. But then I think we have some footage you write about in the chapter, the Bayou Bonjour, that actually it can recover pretty fast.
Yeah, so this is one of the sort of heroes of this section, John Lopez, and it was his thinking originally that basically led to this master plan. And so this is this incredible area that he took me to in an airboat called Big Mar. It basically looked like a lake originally, and you can see sort of Big Mar up in the back. But then all of this area marked as new land has been created by a diversion from the Mississippi River. It's actually a diversion that was originally planned to address the oyster farms in the community, but inadvertently, sort of accidentally, it started to build land, and it's become a kind of the test case for what these much more powerful diversions can do. So incredibly, in a very short amount of time, this gushing, it's actually not even gushing, it's sort of a relatively small diversion, by pumping in sediment from the Mississippi River into this marsh, has created all of this land to emerge out of what looked like a lake. And then, of course, you have plants and then trees growing. Everything you see here was open water about 15 years ago. These trees grow really fast. Or I think black willow trees. There's some cypress. And they help it along. They plant extra trees, and they do there's some other kind of land management methods. But it is quite stunning to look out at this swamp landscape that looks like much of southern Louisiana, and to recognize that this is a man-made creation, and that's what we're trying to do. That's what the state is trying to do throughout the rest of the Delta. And and one other irony I think it's important to point out is that even John Lopez will say, this isn't going to save New Orleans ultimately. That, in 75 years or so, New Orleans, if it exists, may just be an island city off the Gulf, which would then, the Gulf would probably go up to I-10 and Baton Rouge. But this buys us time. This buys us a few decades. And in this climate age, a few decades makes a big difference. It makes a big difference in outcomes for a lot of millions of people. And so again, it's like it's a tricky it's a tricky conversation to have when it starts to become personal for a lot of people who are involved.
But yeah, I mean, I think the discussion of winners and losers, but also the wrong-headed mentality that it's all or nothing. If we cannot solve this problem, why even try? I mean, I think that is really important, that you say buying time gives people time to adapt, gives people time to move, gives communities, some space to figure out what is the best solution and how to make it right for as many people as you can. I think that's actually, another thing I wanted to talk to you about is your article in the book, Losing Earth, because to me, it seems heartbreaking that it looked like we came so close in the 80s to having kind of major international legislation, like modeled after successful legislation like the Montreal Protocol, which banned CFCs, which were destroying the ozone layer. That's like an example of an international treaty. The original President Bush came really close to signing it, but John Sununu kind of put the kibosh on it. So that is a huge story that you researched and told, that was a really different angle than anybody else had ever really done before. So how did you approach that research and come up with that angle? What you must have been
Yeah, I mean, it's felt that I think the story of climate change from approximately 1989 to the present has been pretty well documented. The role of the oil and gas industry to just instill this confusion in the public, to sow disinformation, to pretend that climate change isn't real, and to buy off politicians to try to stop any kind of policy from being passed. What I felt wasn't very well understood or really known about was this period preceding that, essentially from 1979 to 1989, when there was scientific consensus on the issue by 79. It had been studied for decades by then, and all of the projections were in line with what we're seeing today. And you had an effort by a small group of people originally, NASA scientist James Hansen, Rafe Pomerantz, who's an activist, sort of behind the scenes guy on Capitol Hill, and a few other people, Al Gore as a junior congressman at the time, who tried to raise the issue to a level of national and ultimately international concern. And they largely succeeded. I mean, despite a lot of setbacks, by the end of the decade, you have in hand what was seen as a solution, a global treaty to reduce carbon emissions that the U.S. was leading the way on and was going to bring along the rest of the global population, when, of course, it falls apart at the last second, thanks largely to the role of John Sununu, who then is shortly thereafter joined by business advisors in George H.W. Bush's cabinet, and then the oil and gas industry kind of clicks into gear with this disinformation, coordinated disinformation campaign. And so it's a striking, a shocking story, really, of opportunity, of missed opportunity, but also about the challenges that we face. And you see this, and this is something that I found myself writing again and again about in Second Nature as well, the challenges we face when we take on these big problems. It's not to say that they can't be overcome, but it does force us to ask some deeper, more difficult questions about why is it so hard for us to change our way mid path, and what are the obstacles, not just external but internal, that we face when trying to take control of our destiny, really, instead of just this sort of reckless laissez-faire approach to our activities, to our, and our economy, to our industrial production and our stewardship of the planet. So it's a tragic story, but it's also, I think it's a story that there's a lot to learn from, because these figures were forced to really grapple with a lot of these major issues that we're still trying to solve today.
Yeah, and I mean, as you point out, we missed that opportunity, but that doesn't mean that we should stop trying, because any effort we have to either slow things down or give us time is going to be to our benefit. So,
well, I think there's also a lesson. There's a lesson in that it's not enough. I think one thing that people like Rafe Pomerantz learned is that it's not enough simply to to tell the truth and make a logical argument for why change has to happen. That doesn't get you all the way there, and that you need something higher. You need a sort of higher call to action, and you ultimately need a moral argument. You need to put it in terms that are personal to people and not just policy. Al Gore was very good at articulating policy, but that approach was ultimately not enough. And so I think what you see now, 30 plus years later, is this new approach. We have actually seen it start to happen in the last couple of years, especially among younger people who are making a different kind of claim. Not that, we have to act before it's too late, although of course that's true, but we have to act because it's wrong not to act, because we're doing great harm to ourselves by not acting, and ultimately we're betraying the fundamental values of our society if we neglect to act any longer.
Yeah, so we're kind of getting short on time. I want to get back to second nature, but also remind people, if they have any questions for Nathaniel Rich before we sign off in a few minutes, please send them our way. So Nathaniel, the final section of the book, As Gods, to me, and it's about sort of humans. To me, it seems more like that's the 70s sci-fi. It's kind of some of the things are kind of pretty eerie. Are you thinking that?
Sure. Yeah, I'll accept that. Yeah, I'm with you on that.
So I want you to tell us a little bit more about Shin Kabuto and his Immortal jellyfish.
Yeah, Shin Kubota is one of the most delightful people I've ever been fortunate enough to meet. There he is. He's the sweetest guy. He's a scientist in Shirahama, Japan, and he studies the oceans, but he particularly studies hydroids, jellyfish, and he studies a species that's nicknamed the Immortal jellyfish because it after it completes its life cycle, there it is in all its beauty in its jellyfish form, and it ultimately kind of dissolves into a blob, and then starts the life cycle all over again, and it can repeat its life cycle, as far as we know, an infinite amount of times, and so it sort of keeps going, and most scientists are very, very loath to sort of draw any connections between, a jellyfish and human beings when they're asked about, can we learn something about immortality or longevity from these species, except not Kubota, who has dedicated his life, in fact, to trying to isolate the trick of the immortal jellyfish and apply it to human life, and his earnestly held belief is that we will become, as we solve this trick of the jellyfish, we will become immortal ourselves. And he has this. He's become in Japan this kind of Bill Nye the Science Guy. He's on TV all of the time there. And over the years, his work has actually been taken more and more seriously as there's been more genetic research into the species, including efforts to in fact use some of these lessons in human science, and so in medicine. And so, but he also sees as part of his duty, it's not just the figuring out the science part of it, but he feels that until we as a species learn to respect nature, to respect our role in nature, that we're not deserving of immortal life. And so the other part of his life is to go around and educate children and adults to try to teach them the value, the beauty and the value of nature. And so to do that, he has this alter ego persona, Mr. Immortal Jellyfish Man, and he sings songs that he's written that are odes to nature and odes to the jellyfish that I think we can watch at some point, if not, if maybe
Yeah,
at the very end of the show.
I think we're saving that to the very end as a special treat.
Quite beautiful, yeah.
We actually do have a question for you about diverting rivers and biodiversity. So how do you feel creating these man-made river diversion land masses would affect biomass or biodiversity in the swamps? Does it help?
That's a really good question, and that's sort of at the heart of a lot of where the science is right now, and these the state's processes of doing this extremely tedious permit review. Those are the kinds of questions they're asking. The short answer is, in the long term, it's excellent for biodiversity. Of course, the biodiversity of these marshes has decreased as the seawater has come in, has killed a lot of marsh and a lot of the species that live in it. However, in the immediate vicinity of the diversions, which are now brackish water, as you rush in this huge quantities of fresh water, and I should say, these diversions of the river will themselves be rated among the top 5 or 10 rivers in terms of their strength in the country when they open, will totally change the kinds of the ecosystems where they are. So the best example right now is and the number one sort of concern now locally, at least in the press, is a lot of dolphins live in some of these areas in the marsh. When the diversions come through, they will die. There's sort of no doubt about that. Now you could point out that, well, historically dolphins never were swimming in these areas. In fact, in some of these areas they used to be land. Nothing was swimming in them. And so it's not that this is the natural state of things, of course, but there's no natural state of things because all of the marsh is shaped by our hemming in of the river. So in the short term, there will be massive disruptions and cost to some species. It will benefit other species. But the idea is, over time, if these diversions do their work, it will be, for the greater good will be achieved. But it's, again, you have to sort of hurdle over the short-term disruptions to get to the long-term benefits. Mm-hmm. That's the source of a lot of the controversy, Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to thank you so much for joining us, and thank the audience as well. It's just been such a fascinating conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's great to speak with you, as always.
Yeah, and I think as just a special treat to send us out, you mentioned that you're Japanese scientist, that you spent a week trying to follow around. He was from your book, a busy man, is a big devotee of karaoke. So can you tell us a little bit about the song, the clip that we're going to see, and what is he singing about exactly?
This is, in fact, his ode to the scarlet medusa, which is another name for the immortal jellyfish, because it has a scarlet-colored bell. And you'll hear him say, Beni Courage, I think is scarlet medusa. And so this is his ode to the beauty of the immortal jellyfish. And yes, you can request it at karaoke establishments across Japan. It's part of network of songs there.
All right, thank you. I just want to also mention that Nathaniel Rich's book Second Nature is on sale at the book at the Exploratorium bookstore. So I highly recommend it. I kind of raced through it and really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, so let's cue up the fabulous Immortal Jellyfish song.
不老不死の夢を歌います。京都大学の久保田真ことベニクラゲマンです。僕の名前はベニクラゲ、ちっちゃいクラゲです。だけど僕には人にない特別な秘密があるんだ。僕は若返ることができるんだ。もうダメだと思ったらポリプに戻ってワンツースリー、また人生をやり直すことができるんだ。みんなは一度だけの人生だから今を大切にしておくれ。あ、それベニベニ。うちの名前はベニクラゲ、ちっちゃいクラゲです。だけどうちには人いない特別な秘密があるのよ。うちは若返ることができるのよ。もうダメだわと思ったらポリプに戻ってワンツースリー、また人生をやり直すことができるのよ。みんなは一度だけの人生だから今を大切にしておくれ。あ、それベニベニ。わしの名前はベニクラゲ、もうすぐポリプに戻れるぞ。今度遅れる人生で何をしようかしやんちゅう。わしは若返ることができるんだ。20歳のピチピチな体に今から戻るぞ君。今から人生をやり直すことができるんだ。みんなは一度だけの人生だから悔いを残さずに生きてくれ。あ、それベニベニ。